So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give everyone a minute to, as they're all coming in, and then we'll start the session. In the meantime, if you want to use the chat box and just say hi and say which group you're from, that would be great. So for those just joining now, hi, and there's still a few joining us, but in the meantime, just use the chat box, say hi, say where you're from, because they're coming in from across the county. So just say hi in the chat box. There we are. The Wey River Trust. Hi, Alistair. Claire from Betchworth. Right. So I think everybody's in now. So good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Chris Howard, and I am the chairman of the Surrey Association of Local Town and Parish Councils, but I'm also a trustee here at Surrey Wildlife Trust. I'm also vice chairman of my parish council, Warnish Parish Council, and 3 years ago I helped set up two environment groups in our area. So I'm very involved at a grassroots level as well. I'm really delighted to be chairing tonight's meeting. Really looking forward to this webinar. Really pleased with the lineup we've got tonight. But before we start, I've got to just do the normal bit of housekeeping that we do on these sessions. So firstly, we're recording the session. So there might be, you might need to drop out if your internet has problems, or some people like to just view it as a later date. So it's going to be recorded, and it's also going to be going nationally to other wildlife trusts. So there's also an opportunity for you to ask questions, but we're going to let the speakers speak, and then if you can do that, we'll have the question session at the end. We'll try to respond to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to yours, we will come back to you via email. Then if you can pop your questions in the question and answer chat, which is one of the icons at the bottom. If you put it in the chat box, someone will prompt you to say put it in the right box. So make sure you pop it in the Q&A box. But we really want to share your ideas. So do connect in the chat box as well. So we'll be recording the chat and share the links and ideas with all the participants after the conference. Okay, so now the housekeeping is out the way. I just wanted to remind you about the purpose of these webinars. So this is the Community Action for Nature webinar series. And this is a series of webinars that's part of Surrey Wildlife Trust's Wilder Communities programme. And they've been designed to give you a few hints and tips that will hopefully help you to make your neighbourhoods a little bit richer in nature. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Ben Sigley, who's the GIS Research and Monitoring Manager at Surrey Wildlife Trust. Over to you, Ben.
Oh, thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here this evening. Get to talk to you about one of my favourite things, which is ponds. So I'm just going to share my screen now so you can all see my presentation. Hopefully that'll be fine. Do let me know if there's any issues with that, but hopefully you can see everything as intended. So without further ado, yep. So as Chris mentioned, my name is Ben Sigley, and I work for Surrey Wildlife Trust in our research and monitoring team. I used to work in our education team, and I used to get to do pond dipping all the time, which is part of the reason I love ponds so much. But my roots in the pond world are from university. I studied aquatic conservation for my master's degree, and both my undergraduate and my master's theses were based in ponds over in Norfolk. So I have a long love for them, and have spent many happy years at Norwood getting to pond dip with various school groups, and unfortunately don't get to do that so much anymore. But at least I get to do stuff like this and talk about them. So hopefully what I'm going to cover today is a little bit of kind of ecological context of ponds, but as is the purpose of this webinar, also going into a bit of hints and tips, dispelling some common myths about what you should be doing with your ponds, and then also covering a little bit about the scary legal bit around great crested newts. So why do we care about ponds? Apart from just being lovely in general, ponds are real biodiversity hotspots in our kind of wider landscape. Since the 1950s, we've lost over 50% of ponds in this country. It's estimated that that was over 1 million ponds. That's as a result of changing land uses, the changing ways in which agriculture works. And people like the Freshwater Habitats Trust are trying to improve that with their Million Ponds project and bring ponds back into our landscape, because they really function as these important connectivity stepping stones in a way. If you think about if you are an aquatic animal or a species that relies on aquatic environments, getting from one to another is quite a lot harder than if you're a bird and you can just fly from one to another. So the more little stepping stones there are for things that rely on water, the easier it is for them to traverse throughout the landscape. So it's really important to have lots and lots and lots of even small ponds around, just to ensure that there is greater connectivity for these things, especially with threats oncoming like climate change and increasing habitat fragmentation. It's more important than ever that these things can manage to move around our landscape. So they're quite threatened, and they have more species per area than any other type of water body. So we always think of like the ocean as this amazing mega diverse place, coral reefs, but ponds are actually denser in their diversity than any other water body. So that's a great fact about them that I love. Loads of vulnerable and endangered species are associated with them, whether that's things in the water like European eels or otters, water voles. Things out of the water as well rely on them, as well as things like amphibians, obviously our great crested newts, plenty of different birds as well, other invertebrate species. But unfortunately, globally, as I'm sure many of you are aware, most of these things are taking a bit of a hammering. And out of all vertebrate groups, freshwater species have seen the largest decline in the most recent WWF Living Planet report. They've calculated 83% global decline in freshwater populations, which is staggeringly higher than some of the other groups. So quite sad, but this is why you're here, to learn how to have a pond and make it a good one, so we can have more of these freshwater oases within an otherwise hostile landscape. So a little bit of ecology to start with. If we think about the cross profile of a pond, it's quite logical when you talk through it, but it's not something people always think about. So when you have a cross profile like this, you can see it split up into these different sections, and generally you have trends from the left side to the right side, where you're seeing a transition from really wet conditions to really dry conditions, conditions with low organic matter, so there's not a lot of plant material, to high organic matter where there's loads of plant material. Out in the open water, we have very low soil strength, but very high light levels. And then in a kind of wet woodland on the edges, we might have lower light levels, but higher soil strength, which can support things like trees. So with a pond or any kind of wetland habitat, you have a real gradient of conditions moving through from the deep water to the shallower water, up onto the swampy edges, and then into the slightly wetter habitat, slightly drier habitat, but still a bit soggy on the edges with our wet woodlands, our alder, our willow trees will grow there. So you can see even from this diagram, one of the kind of reoccurring themes of this presentation is that everything has its place. So in certain parts of this diagram are certain types of plants, in other parts of the diagram are other types of plants, because everything has its own niche, and the best kind of pond provides as many niches as possible for different things to live. So zooming out a bit to a kind of wider pondscape, obviously I don't know how much space most of you have to put ponds in or do things with ponds, but in an ideal world, we would love to see a kind of complex, dynamic, messy pondscape with big ponds, little ponds, seasonal ponds, permanent ponds, bits that are just soggy and muddy, bits that are covered in vegetation. And instead of just having one big lake, as in the traditional one in the top left, we want a kind of complex of multiple basins that are doing different things at different times of the year. They might all join up again in winter when it's wetter. Some of them might completely dry up in the summer. This kind of really dynamic, ephemeral habitat is really the optimal kind of pond habitat. It's not something you see very often because it doesn't always look nice. It's not always what people want in their gardens or in their community spaces and parks. But if you're going for the real kind of top tier wildlife pond, this is the kind of system you want. In terms of a more zoomed in look at the cross profile of the pond then and the actual physical structure, you can see on the top right, you've got kind of the cut in half version of the pond. And you can see that, again, going along the theme of variety, we have some really shallow bits, some medium depth bits, some deeper bits. But one thing people don't realize is that deep water is almost the worst bits of the pond for wildlife. Obviously, you want some deep water because certain things prefer that. But in the diagram here, you can see about 80% of it is on the shallower side and only 20% of it is on the deeper side. And you'll see on some of the later slides why having really, really shallow areas is highly beneficial. But in terms of the deeper bits and the bits that are have enough depth to have submergent plants growing in them, you really need to think about the underwater architecture of what's going on as well. So having fully submergent plants, like some of the ones in these images here, things like water milfoil, hornwort. Some people have elodia in their ponds as well, which isn't great, but still does the job. Various kinds of pond weeds as well. So you're providing this underwater architecture, and you can see even in these two images, things that are touching the surface, but then have stems going down. So you're having really a complex habitat because it's not just open water, it's got all kinds of layers and intricacies to it. Because if you think about, if you're a small fish, a small invertebrate, a tadpole, you need places to hide, you need places to ambush things from, you need places to feed, you may need material to build your case with if you're a caddisfly. So having the underwater structure is extremely important for any kind of life in your pond. So in terms of what you should do to look after the pond once you've got it, there's loads of common myths out there, and some of them I've kind of talked about already, but these are the few that I tend to hear the most. The first one being X time of year is the best for pond management. Lots of people say winter, for example, is the best for pond management, or summer is the best time for planting or whatever. And there essentially isn't an answer to that, because any time of year is good for some things and bad for other things. So typically we'll try and do pond work in winter because that might be better for things like newts, which tend to have a bit more priority, I guess. But there will always be times of year that are good for some things and bad for other things. So there is no ideal time of year. It really depends on what you are trying to achieve and what kind of wildlife you are most interested in supporting. Bigger is better is another one you hear a lot of. But as you probably got the vibe of from the slides earlier about the idea of a pondscape, you don't want just one big one. You want lots of little ones that are very diverse and varied in their size, their structure, their contents, how permanent they are. Drying out, again, referring back to that one, drying out is one of the best things that can happen for some types of biodiversity. So if your pond is drying out in the summer, that can be a very natural process. There are some very rare species of plants and dragonflies that highly depend on ephemeral ponds that dry up in the summer. Another one you hear often is that shading from trees is bad. And that if you have trees, that all the leaves will fall in and the pond will get murky and it will smell and it will be horrible. It probably will smell and it might look horrible, but again, certain species will be very reliant on those kind of conditions. They will prefer a very dense, litter-rich pond. They'll like the shading. There's various rare beetles that prefer these kind of habitats, for example. Another one, ponds need to be managed. Ponds need to be dredged to keep them at least 2 meters deep. Don't have to do it. As I'll come on to, it's really this variety of ponds at different stages in their life cycle that is the most beneficial. And as we covered already, deep doesn't necessarily mean it's great for wildlife. You also don't need an inflow or a pump so the water doesn't go stagnant. Obviously, ponds are a natural feature in our landscape. They've existed for thousands and thousands of years before pond pumps were invented. They do not need them. So I'm going to go through 4 principles now of general good pond advice, and that have been slightly adapted from what the Freshwater Habitats Trust suggest, but credit to them for coming up with them in the first place. So first one is what I call ugly duckling syndrome, that people think that ponds that look ugly are not great for wildlife and they don't want them in their garden or their allotment or wherever because they look ugly. So as I've talked about already, every part of a pond at every stage of life is valuable for something. The classic example of this ugly duckling thing is something called a drawdown zone. So in the picture here, you can see that there's a very kind of muddy edge around this pond. And as it has dried up in the summer, it's retreated just to be wet in the middle. And you've got this big shelf of mud all around the edge, and it looks very devoid of life and not necessarily very pretty. The drawdown zone is anywhere that's under 10 centimeters deep. It usually dries up completely in summer, and it's been documented to have 2 or 3 times as many species as slightly deeper water. So this area is incredibly important to have, just that in that shallow, less than 10 centimeter water depth. But then when it dries up, it's also really important because things like dragonflies, other invertebrates can lay their eggs there where fish can't then eat them. Lots of birds will use this kind of muddy banks to come and feed. Various plants will grow better there at different times of year. So really, it's one of the best features you can have for a pond. It just doesn't look very nice. The second thing is that variety is the spice of life. And as I've alluded to, you want as many different microhabitats as you can have within your pond, around your pond, in the pondscape, as it were, and having a mosaic of a habitat instead of just one thing. If you have one thing that is all the same, you are supporting only one community of species. If you have a pond with an open bit, a shady bit, a shallow bit with plants, a shallow bit without plants, a muddy bit on the edge with different plants, you're providing so much more opportunity for different things to live there. So it's really about promoting the variety within the pond itself and having all of these different microhabitats to support different communities of wildlife, whether those are invertebrates, amphibians, birds, mammals. There'll be plenty of stuff that will benefit from every different kind of microhabitat you can provide. In terms of your management, safety first, you should always survey before you do things to your pond. It's really easy to not realize what can be in there just from looking. If you look at a pond without sort of getting a bit messy and putting your net in, you're not going to realize what's going on in there. There are certain things that you will not see just from looking at it, whether it's because they're hiding, they're buried in the sediment at the bottom, they're just not very visible. You should always try and find out a little bit more about what's going on before you start doing things, because it may be that something important is living there and you don't want to disturb it. And a good kind of general tip is just not to do, like I say, don't do anything without surveying, and don't do anything without understanding your pond. Even if you survey, what you found might be relatively meaningless because you'll be like, oh yeah, there's some bugs there. But if you don't understand perhaps the ecological value or what those bugs are kind of telling you about the ecology of the pond, then you may be doing something bad by managing it. So it's really important to understand your pond before you start doing things. The last great principle to follow is the idea of buffer zones. So at the edge of your pond, it doesn't stop there. Like we've talked about, drawdown zones, marginal plants, soggy bits around the edges. This habitat is very important for birds and amphibians, shelter for things, routes in and out of the pond. And important as well, particularly in gardens or agricultural land, it acts as a buffer to stop anything going into the pond that shouldn't. So, for example, reed beds are very, very good at removing excess nutrients from water. So they would stop your fertilizers, if you're applying those in your garden, from getting into your pond and causing it to eutrophy. So having a buffer zone is very important. And with the buffer zones, it is the bigger the better. If the bigger the buffer zone, the more protected your pond will be from anything in runoff that you might not want to go in there. And all of it as well will provide fantastic habitat for marginal things, birds, etc. And then just to finish up, I have no idea how much time I have left, but to go through some legal stuff quickly.
You're over, Ben, so hurry up.
I'm over. Oh,
Go on,
sorry.
go
Quick.
for it.
We don't want to learn about legal stuff anyway. It's
Yes, you
boring.
do. Yes, you do. Go on.
So great crested newts, lots of people worry about them when they're managing ponds. They are a protected species under European law as well as UK law. And that law, the Habitats Directive at the EU level and at the UK level, it's the Wildlife and Countryside Act, that covers the newts themselves, it covers their eggs and their breeding sites and their hibernation sites. And they have a strict licensing procedure if you are a developer and you are going to do something on a site where there are known to be great crested newts. The law itself obviously carries penalties for breaking it, such as fines, etc. But they're really aimed at developers who are purposefully doing nasty things. If you have newts in your garden pond, you are probably not going to get fined. Don't quote me on that. But as a responsible citizen, you should try and mitigate any effects to great crested newts as best you can. So general tips to avoid causing any disturbance to newt populations would be: check if they're there, obviously, before you do anything. Late autumn and winter for your management work is good to avoid newts because they won't be in the pond at that time of year. When you are doing gardening, management work, be really mindful of where they might be hibernating around the pond. Soggy leaf piles, old log piles might be places that they'd like to hang out. And also ensuring that there's no access obstructions, because these are amphibious animals. They will leave the pond, go on land to hibernate, come back to the pond, perhaps a different pond. So ensure that there are unobstructed routes for them to safely get between these places. And the main thing is, if you find them, stop doing whatever you're doing and seek advice from someone like the Freshwater Habitats Trust. And I know I'm really behind on time, but I just wanted to finish with this really fantastic video filmed in a pond in Norfolk to give you an idea of what's going on under the water in a thriving wildlife pond. The sound probably isn't working, so I will narrate it for you in my dulcet tones, but you can see as the person is walking through with a GoPro on the end of a pond net, you can see the underwater structure, the architecture I was talking about with the different plants that are growing there. You can see all sorts of invertebrates flittering around, mayflies, damselflies, tadpoles, and you can see the real thriving nature of what's going on under there. So thank you very, very much for listening. Sorry I went over time, and I will hand back over to Chris.
Ben, thank you. That's fantastic. Really useful. I have 2 ponds in our village, and one we're managing for wildlife and one we're managing for people and ducks. But that was such useful talk. So moving on quickly though, we're now going to have a chat with Isabel Hall, who is the program manager at Meadow Makers at Plant Life. So I'm going to hand over to Isabel.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm pretty much at the other end of the country to yourselves. I'm up in the Lake District, but I work for Plant Life, which is a UK-wide organisation, and so we are based actually all over the country. So I just need to share my screen. My mouse has decided it's going to just play up a moment, just one moment whilst something's going on. There we go. Okay, right, I wanted to talk you through the creating and managing a wildflower meadow, the making of a successful community project. It's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but as has already been said, the slides and maybe the recording are going to be shared so that hopefully you can go back over anything that obviously any of us have said as we're talking. But I just wanted to, first of all, just give you a very quick introduction to Plant Life. So Plant Life is the international conservation charity working to secure a world rich in wild plants and fungi. And in actual fact, we've got staff. We do work on the international stage. So we've got staff who are about to go to COP15 in Montreal. So this is the one for biodiversity, and they will be speaking there and chatting with delegates to try and secure, it across the international sort of stage. So we don't just work in this country. So what do? We carry out conservation, education and outreach work. On our reserves, we do have 23 reserves, of which about half are grasslands. We do this in partnership with many others, much of this through funded programs of activity. So this will be, similar to obviously how I'm here to talk to you today through Surrey Wildlife Trust. We can advise and publish best practice guidance. We have a Good Meadows guide and also an award-winning road verges guide, working with local authorities and national highways who manage the strategic road network, carry out research and gather data to inform government policy. We currently have 3 leadership programs: grasslands, temperate rainforests and species recovery. So I am the program lead for grasslands, working with a team of people, and I'm currently working on a England-wide project to restore grasslands with private landowners and local authorities as well, and community groups. So focusing in obviously as grasslands and the theme of this presentation, we've delivered numerous programs over the last 10 or 15 years. There's a few of them just listed there, all of which have been funded by a whole variety of different people. So it might just be worth sort of defining what is a community meadow. So the predominantly areas of grassland that are community owned, in public ownership or privately owned, but basically are accessible to a large proportion of the community. So examples include parks, road verges, schools, church grounds, waste grounds, residential homes, the grounds of residential homes. There will be many other variations on that, but that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about in this case. So as you can see, they also don't have to be big areas. They can be, and obviously if you had got a considerable sort of area, something the size of a park or a football pitch or something sort of in size, but they can also be, small areas. So you can obviously see here we've got something around a housing estate, something in a churchyard, and something along the edge of a playing field, sort of along a fence line. So you don't have to think big. It can just be some very small areas which could help you, as a community or even as an individual, in that you might not be taking on, too bigger, if you like, undertaking. Also just wanted to sort of perhaps just say what the difference is from Plant Life's perspective of what is a wildflower meadow and what is perhaps a pictorial meadow. So Plant Life are talking mostly about native wildflowers, largely perennial, and also includes grasses, whereas pictorial meadows that you often see perhaps in an urban context in particular, which are cornfield annuals that are resown each year. We're not saying that they are bad. Clearly they add colour, and also they do provide food sources for butterflies and bumblebees and other small mammals. But from our perspective, we really are talking about those perennial wildflower areas. So they don't have to be resown sort of each year. It's about how you manage them to make the flowers keep coming up. There's a Plant Life have published a leaflet called Keeping the Wild in Wildflower. There will be a link to that shared later on as well. So it's just to say where we are coming from. So you've identified a potential site. What's next? is it already a community meadow but needs some additional help or some work? You know, there are lots of areas already out there. So find out if there's already a volunteer group. There's often volunteer groups, associated with these grasslands. So lots of park landscapes, for example, often have friends of groups. So that might be something that you might want to get involved in. Or is it an area that you think could become a community meadow? So first off, perhaps get in touch with your local council, whether that's a parish council, you know, whatever level, to express your interest in more wildlife friendly management of your local green spaces. Public support from local people can also help to obviously bring change. Strength in numbers, so think about whether you actually want to form a volunteer group, and it doesn't have to be anything formal. It could just be a group of, you know, your neighbours or your residents or something, or it could be an interest, a group of people who are interested in that particular aspect. You also need to consider who uses the site at the moment and might be impacted on if you're going to change the management of it, which is why it might be you know, useful to consider just creating changing the management on a part of the site. There is a video link shared towards the end or at the end of the presentation, which basically is in a park sort of landscape, and clearly the park has many different users. They have just basically changed the management in a part of it to benefit what sort of wildlife and create a wildflower meadow, which adds another element obviously of interest to the park and a different perspective for people to enjoy. So a bit like Ben mentioned as well, the less exciting but essential part, there are some considerations that you want to take, that you'll need to bear in mind as you move down this road. So the legal bit. Who owns it? Obviously, we've talked about finding that out maybe from your local authority. Do you need any permissions if you're actually looking at changing the management of the site? Do you actually perhaps need some sort of legal agreement, depending on how you're actually going to manage it and who you're going to use to manage it? Insurance, if you're going to have volunteers working on the site, you might need to consider that. Similarly, first aiders, health and safety, and you might need to undertake a risk assessment. Now, there are organisations out there, and I'm sure the Wildlife Trust can help you as well, but there are organisations out there, often Council for Voluntary Services often have lots of information around how community groups sort of form and all these different things that you can do, that you need to do, and they might have various templates and things that you could follow to make sure that you're actually doing everything, if you like, both correctly but also safely, but also then it means that everybody can enjoy what you're doing. Oops, all right. So now we're on to the exciting part, creating an area of species-rich grassland. So there are two aspects to it. You could basically create, but also you could enhance an area. And if you're enhancing, that is where the mowing comes into it. Now, I am just going to have to flick between screens, so do bear with me. I'm hoping that this is going to work. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So how to make a meadow with native wildflowers, even if you've only got a small area, you know, it all adds value. Choose an open, sunny area, no nettles or brambles. First of all, it's important to perhaps take a closer look in the spring and the summer. What's already growing there? A good meadow can be home to more than 100 different grasses and flowers. But these are the key things. If your area is bare ground or has fewer than 5 wildflowers, you're going to create a meadow. If your area has more than 5 different wildflowers already, you're probably going to enhance a meadow. So if we just focus in on the left-hand side, on the creating of a meadow, basically, you need to cut the grass short, create some bare ground, and then seed the area. Sounds really simple, and you just need, equipment that you've probably got in, or somebody's got in their garden sheds, a mower, a strimmer, or a scythe, and a rake. What you actually need to do as well is to take off the mowings, because if left, they'll decompose. Wildflowers actually only want very poor soil. You can use them to create habitat piles to encourage other wildlife, or of course you could compost it. Then you need to create at least 50% of bare ground, and you could just rake that vigorously. If you want to do larger areas, that's perhaps best done with a harrow. And again, you could see the area using green here. I'm not going to go into the detail of that partly because I haven't got the time, because I'm going to assume that most of you are going to be working relatively small areas, and so therefore you're probably going to be buying wildflower seeds. The other key thing here is to make sure that that seed isn't sourced from outside the UK. Lots of wildflower seed, or some wildflower seed packets that are sold in garden centres and things will be. So you just need to double check that it's not sourced from out. And the more local, the better. Again, the Wildlife Trust might be able to help you in sourcing seed of local provenance. You can mix your seed with sand for easier spreading, and then just sprinkle it and gently trample it in. If it's really dry spells, water if possible, but obviously do take care not to wash away the seeds. In the coming months, just pull up any invasive species that perhaps come in, because they will out-compete with the wildflowers. But also it's important, because we're creating meadows using native perennials, they often take a couple of years to establish. So please don't get disheartened if it doesn't seem to work in the first year. And then from the second year onwards, you follow this annual management plan. Now I'm just going to stop sharing that screen again and go back to my original presentation. There we go. So the ongoing part is the management. It's cutting, mowing and removing at the right time. Sounds quite simple. So this could be done in the second stage of, in the second year of a meadow that you've created. But if you also just need to enhance an area that already exists, then this is really a very simple wheel that basically says to leave it in April, May, June and July. So don't cut in that time that everybody is obviously normally out mowing. In August and September, you can cut it. Basically, when really what you want to do is wait till the plants have seeded, because obviously that's your seed source then for your following year. Then through the autumn and the winter time, leave the meadow unless it gets it does grow. Obviously this year has been particularly mild through October and November, even up here in the lakes, and stuff has still been growing. So if you do need to take another cut, then that is fine. And then make your first cut in March of the following spring or early spring, and then just keep going. You might need to enhance it at different times, as you move through the management over a couple of years. So you could buy some plug plants and add the biodiversity at different stages. What else might you need? Tell people what you're doing and why. Wildflower areas sometimes can look a bit messy. So again, a bit like Ben was saying with the ponds, and people think it's untidy. It isn't basically untidy. It will be, providing habitat for many things. So either put some signs up, or you could put a newsletter. If there is a parish newsletter, you could write something in that. If you're comfortable using social media, then obviously clearly that's another way to let people know. Equipment.
Can I hurry you on a bit, please,
Yeah,
Isabel?
certainly. Yeah, sorry. Equipment. Obviously, a lot of people have those in their garden sheds, I'm sure. Team of willing volunteers. Lots of different groups out there who might be interested. Funding. You might need some funding to help you buy either some of the equipment or the seed. So ask your local authority. Also, often supermarkets and phone companies have funds for local community groups, which are normally very easy to access. So those are the things you might need. And then don't forget to celebrate what you've done. National Meadows Day, this was an initiative set up with Plant Life probably 5 or 6 years ago now. It's always the first weekend in July. So use that day to celebrate what you've done. You could also hold events to showcase what you've done at other times of year. Engage your local community in the management, collecting seed, scything, plug planting, all the different ways, or the mowing as well. What can you do next? Monitor your sites to go back each year to see what's appeared. If you're inspired to do more, there's No Mow May, which is a Plant Life initiative. Wax Cap Watch, which are grassland fungi. Also, you might want to get involved in recording other species that are in your wildflower meadow. Both the Butterfly Conservation Trust and the Bumblebee Conservation Trust have various activities that you can do to record there and then let them know what your findings are. Here's a list of useful resources that are available, will be made available to you. So that's the post that I shared, and then these are obviously various links. Plant Life have a Meadows Hub, which is full of information and a very useful resource. So thank you for listening. I do apologise, that was a really very whistle-stop tour. I just wanted to share a short film that I hope you will find inspiring.
Thank you, Isabel. Absolutely brilliant, that film. The photography is fantastic, really useful. Now, moving right swiftly along, because we are a little bit behind time. I'm afraid our next speaker, Emma Pavans, is not able to join us tonight due to unforeseen circumstances. So she has pre-recorded her presentation tonight. So with no further ado, we're going over to Emma's pre-recorded presentation.
Hi everyone, so sorry I can't be there in person today, but thank you so much to the Wildlife Trust for having me and having Pan UK, and thank you so much to Chris as well for chairing and making this a really great evening. So I'm Emma from Pesticide Action Network UK. I'm a campaigner, and we're the only charity focused on ending the harms caused by pesticides and encouraging alternatives. And today in particular, we're focusing on urban pesticides, which you'll learn all about, and our campaign, which is directed on that, called Pesticide Free Towns. So I will share my screen and tell you all about that. So let's start here. So urban pesticides. So our Pesticide Free Towns campaign, that's the logo at the bottom left there, that started in 2015. And often we think of pesticides, mostly in agriculture to help with food growing, and also in residence homes, like in garden use. And so actually, a pesticide-free towns campaign is really geared at pesticides that are used in the public space. I mean, it is to do also with individuals. There is an angle of encouraging people to not use pesticides in their gardens, but really it's about thinking of your wider community and how your urban spaces are being managed. So, what do we mean by that? So pesticides in urban spaces are used mostly by councils, but also by land managers, so maybe housing estates or schools. And then again by residents. So residents, your job is to not use pesticides in your gardens, in your allotments. But the conversation does get a little bit more complicated when we want our councils to not be using pesticides anymore. And so by pesticides, what do we really mean? So pesticides is an umbrella term. That includes herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, mossicides, a lot of different icides. And so these are chemicals designed to kill any pest, any problem, or what is deemed a problem. And so in this case, a weed that's going to grow in various spaces. So, you can see on this picture here, a council worker that's spraying in between pavement blocks in what looks like a park. But, we also see them being used in tree pits along roads. They'll also be used along the road there, along walls. They're also used in parks under furniture, so under this barrier, but also under benches, under signs, or along the actual pathways. And they're also used in sports pitches, churchyards, and in a way, most worryingly, also used in playgrounds. So you can see in the forefront there, that's a playground. They'll be used on the actual furniture, often underneath, and sort of the spongy material, well, the rubbery material that is covered in playgrounds, but you see here under a hedge. And so the telltale sign is usually the sort of yellowing grass or sort of dying plant, whatever it may be. But most of the time, frankly, unless you're in a perverse way lucky to see the person spraying, you won't actually know it had been done. And, you'll be in a space that might been sprayed a few hours before. And so why is that a cause for concern? So first of all, we are aware that we're in this insect apocalypse, that we have this real biodiversity decline, and that, our agricultural spaces are incredibly depleted. We have monocultures, and a lot of these species are going to be suffering in those spaces and actually coming and relying on urban spaces as a sort of potential safe haven. So, again, we know that these spaces are depleted. So we just had the recent study that showed that actually a third of hoverflies are now endangered. And actually hoverflies are the second most important pollinator after bees. And, the most used herbicide, the most used chemical by councils is actually glyphosate, which is, a herbicide. And that's been shown to be toxic to bumblebees, sort of the substance in itself, but also the other elements that are added to the concoction. So it's never just glyphosate, it's often a product like Roundup. So that's been shown to be toxic to bumblebees and to hoverflies now. And it's this chain of command, or the chain of life. It's there's less resources for these insects, less places for them to nest, and that's going to then affect birds as well, who have less resources. So yeah, it's depleted insects, depleted wildlife as a result. And we're also seeing aquatic life being affected because these pesticides, if they're used in the wrong place, will be running off into the water, or if they're used and then it rains within a few days, then that chemical can then just as much run off into the water. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done to try and help aquatic life and support it. So that, that is the framework, the context that these pesticides are being used in, and the effect that they're going to have on biodiversity in urban spaces. The other side of it, and very much a cause for concern, is the health impact. So the health impact to the workers that are using these substances, so the WHO, the World Health Organization, has shown that glyphosate is a probable carcinogen. Again, this is the chemical that workers use the most, and there were court cases in the US that the workers won because they had developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a terrible form of cancer. But this is also, harmful to residents. It's chronic exposure. These chemicals have been shown to often be endocrine disruptors. So, tamper with our reproductive system, tamper with our hormone system, basically. It's also been associated to worsening asthma and different lung conditions, different chronic conditions, associated to cancer. And children are very much more vulnerable to this. So, it's tampering with children's hormonal systems, because it's used in spaces they go in regularly, where they're crawling on the ground, interacting or maybe holding in their mouths these different surfaces. And they're smaller, so these smaller amounts will actually have a greater impact on them. And finally, really something to not overlook is the harm that these chemicals have on pets. So again, our pets are going to be on this freshly sprayed grass, potentially, and or in these bushes, walking on a pavement that's been sprayed. And there has been many cases now reported of pets having various ramifications from this exposure, from being ill to their paws being burnt, to actual death. So yeah, it's a real factor, and these are all factors that we can avoid. So just to give you some context quickly of the policy landscape, I think after this fear stories, why isn't this banned on a national level? So we are pushing, particularly for glyphosate, to be banned on a national level, but we do just call for a national ban on urban pesticides. So glyphosate, again, we talk about this almost interchangeably because it is the most used, but we do say pesticides in general. So glyphosate was narrowly reallowed in 2020 by the EU. So back when the UK was part of the EU. But it was stipulated that member nations should minimize the use in public spaces such as parks, playgrounds, and gardens. So sort of these sensitive spaces, the EU said these are spaces these chemicals shouldn't be used in. So when people tout that it is safe and that the EU has allowed it, actually that's not entirely true. And so it is reallowed in the UK until 2025, and then we'll see what happens. But the general tendency, and a lot of countries in the EU, such as France, have actually already banned the chemical. So the general tendency is towards national bans. And so the other side of the penny as well, when we're talking about so much biodiversity loss, is the Environment Act in the UK in 2021, telling local authorities that they have this general duty to support biodiversity. And create these local nature recovery strategies. So Surrey has one. And, it's really about trying to connect these issues. So showing that, on one hand, you have these really fantastic biodiversity measures in place in your borough, in your county. And on the other hand, you still are using pesticides that have been shown to be harmful to biodiversity. So it's really trying to connect these dots and create some joint up thinking in these policies, and hopefully include measures in these local nature recovery strategies against pesticides. So really, it's about a change in mindsets, what we're talking about here. It's about thinking of our counties, thinking about our urban spaces as spaces that have a potential to be beneficial, actually, for wildlife, and as spaces that are more, wild and supportive for, the well-being of communities and, human and non-human. So it's very important to specify here that we're not calling for, wild cities where pavements are completely overgrown. There is very much a duty to, keep pavements clear and keep them well maintained, especially for people in wheelchairs or for people who use buggies. There is very much these accessibility issues that we're concerned about. And, maintaining spaces, pavements shouldn't, start getting completely depleted. But there are areas that we can dedicate and that we can, create especially for biodiversity. So, tree pits are already areas that have soil and have plants. Those can be dedicated for that, or, creating different spaces in our parks, or, unpaving is also a popular movement of creating more spaces that are wild, specifically in our urban spaces. And we're seeing as well that these wild plants beyond sort of planted plants are actually much more beneficial for insects, twice as beneficial for insects than previously thought. So there is this element of not reinventing the wheel and not trying to get ahead of what nature does all by itself much better than we could do. So yeah, really underlining this need for more wilderness, controlled wilderness, we like to think of it as. And so alternatives to pesticides, yeah, so you saw on the previous slide, there are lots of alternatives. So there are lots of ways of keeping our pavements and parks clear of weeds that absolutely do not entail the use of pesticides. So here, I won't go into too much detail, but the cheap alternative is no alternative. So, in parks, in sort of, there's a lot of gardens, spaces now that are letting certain areas go wild and mowing around them or mowing less often. So that's, again, something we're hearing about today. So yeah, preventative measures. So designing spaces in advance so that they're unfriendly for weed growth. So mulching is a really great example, but cover planting. Anyway, so this idea of designing your city so that we're designing spaces that weeds can't grow there in the first place. And then, more involved ways, so the old-fashioned way, though just as valuable, just as well done, of hoeing, raking, mowing, hand weeding. That's really popular if you get the community involved. Then there's, new technologies if you have bigger spaces, so using brushes, using hot water, using foam stream, which is sort of a different heated up foam, but completely eco. So lots of different alternatives available there. And then there are also alternatives for invasive species, which we know councils have a duty to remove. So again, there's entire businesses that are set up to try and manage this plant growth, unwanted plant growth, with sustainable and non-chemical and non-harmful alternatives. And so the benefits of going pesticide free, it's kind of the other side of the negatives of using pesticides. Reduced, so for the environment, so reduced pollution, both in the air, the ground, the water. As I stated before, it's a major source of water pollution. So that's really a cost saving, but also very much environmentally friendly option. Then for biodiversity, thinking of, the depleting insect life, so really helping benefit insects and soil microorganisms, birds, amphibians, and so on. And then citizens, it's all about putting citizens first and really thinking of vulnerable residents, and so protecting them. And again, like going pesticide free is part of a wider image, wider approach, and with well-being of residents in mind. The quality of life of your residents will be improved by having more wilderness around and having more pockets of the unexpected. And this is specifically in terms of, opportunities for residents and really well-being of residents. There's this opportunity to educate and to work with residents. So, there's a lot of places that have decided to either voluntarily through residents groups or through the council calling for it, of having volunteer groups that go and weed certain areas or plant up, adopt their street or adopt different tree pits. And then really successfully as well, we've seen that putting up signs that say that, we're leaving this area for biodiversity, so we're not using pesticides, has been really, really well received by local communities. So really this idea of working with and educating residents and taking them on this journey with you if you decide to go pesticide free. And so some of the other opportunities, because, we work with hundreds of councils across the UK, we work with campaigners, but just as much with councils in going pesticide free. And, the opportunities are, protecting your staff, of course, like avoiding that they use chemicals that they don't really have to use, retraining them, so having new opportunities and new knowledge building, reducing your costs potentially, so it's all about approaching your area as a sort of puzzle. Different areas in the county, for example, in Surrey, will have different approaches. Some of them you can actually mow less, or you can not spray if there's high footfall. There's so many approaches that you can take that actually could end up saving you money. You're investing in your local green economy if you're working with a local business. And then I think the strongest point is really creating more resilience in your community, creating new networks, creating new conversations between the council and existing green organizations and green groups, that are friends of parks or, street groups. There'll be lots of residents that are really keen on getting involved, and it's a way of really tapping into things that are already happening and strengthening those networks already. So yeah, the key message is, when you're still using pesticides, you're kind of undermining, well, you're definitely undermining your own efforts for biodiversity. You know, I know there are some really great measures in place, you know, to protect pollinators, and by still spraying, that's, you know, kind of a disjointed approach and not in your own favor. The other key message is that there is no silver bullet. You know, it's, before it was just glyphosate, just this sort of blanket approach. Now it's about developing an adapted solution. So it won't be just one thing that you'll take as a replacement for glyphosate. It'll be about thinking of your county, thinking of your town as a whole space, and how can you start thinking of those spaces as, you know, a park and a pavement, and, you know, all these different spaces will have different approaches. And, you know, again, it's this idea of a puzzle, and some of those approaches will actually end up saving you money in your new approach. And public support is crucial. That's really a big one. Getting the public involved from the start, so that they don't, you know, suddenly see this change in management of our streets, and that they really understand that, you know, the council is actually doing really great things for biodiversity by not spraying anymore, and that might look a little bit different, or there might be a little bit of a transition period, but that it's a wanted thing, and it's there to protect residents and to support biodiversity. And the last thing I'll say is that, you know, change is very much possible. So this map on the right shows, you know, in green, all the places that have gone pesticide free already. So we're up to 50 places now, 50 councils that have decided to go pesticide free. In orange, it's the places that have campaigns, so that are working towards that. And in pink, it's the places that have measures in place. So altogether, we're at about 100 places that have either taken measures or gone pesticide free. And there's another 100 or so campaigners that are currently working on other places to go pesticide free. So there's a lot of activity, and you'd be really, you know, joining a network of places that have done this. And pesticide free towns and ourselves at Pan UK have worked with hundreds of councils, as you can see, across the UK, and supporting them and going pesticide free.
Great, I hope you found that a useful little session with Emma there. Keep the questions coming in, and if there's any that we can't answer on Emma's behalf, we can send them to Emma and get back to you about them. We're going to do something a little bit different now. Just for a session, something else, we're going to do a poll, see how this one works. So Claire is going to launch a poll, and you'll see on your screen a pledge for nature, and there's a few options for you to select your answers. So we'll allow about 30 seconds to plan the poll, for you to have a look at the poll, and then we'll be able to sum up the results and give you the feedback. So I'm going to leave you doing that. We've got about 30 seconds. And then I think Claire will pop up the results for you. Okay, so Claire, are we ready to go there with the results? Yes, here we go. So 60% say they're going to leave their grass long. Excellent. 68% are going to do a wildflower meadow. That's fantastic, but quite an interesting spread across the whole. So thank you very, very much for those results. And good luck with everything. And Surrey Wildlife Trust are here if you need anything. Do come back to us, and we can spread it around. You know, if it's an issue with the council, you can come back to me, or we can put you in touch with some of our speakers. I'd now like to move on to our last speaker, and that is Stuart from Surrey Wildlife Trust, Stuart Fleming, and he is a Space for Nature officer with Surrey Wildlife Trust. Over to you, Stuart.
Chris, so as you said, my name's Stuart. I'm a reserves officer for Surrey Wildlife Trust. So I basically spend my days out on nature reserves all over Surrey, carrying out practical habitat management work. So it's a tough job, but I love it. So let me just share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Come on. Right, there we go. Okay, so what I plan to do is kind of try and provide you with a rough guide to when in the year certain conservation management tasks should be carried out. Some of this is set out by legislation, while much is according to best practice. Now, the timing of many of these tasks is prescribed by the activities of the plants and animals whose habitats we're looking after. Reproduction, hibernation, growing seasons, feeding, migrations will all have an impact on our work calendar. Some of these timings will, by necessity, be quite fluid as climate change rears its ugly head and causes the seasons and their associated plant and animal behaviour to become topsy-turvy. But at the moment, most of these work. Okay, so the calendar. The way I've decided to do it is I'm going to go through on a task-by-task basis rather than month by month, as that seems to me to be the clearest way to do it. I'm sure I haven't included every single different management technique out there, but I've tried to include the main things that take up most of our year. Okay, the first one of those is scrub clearance. Now, the major factor which affects when in the year we can carry out scrub clearance work is the necessity of avoiding disturbance of nesting birds. Now, officially, bird nesting season in England is from the beginning of March until the end of August. We generally are on the side of caution as a trust and start our scrub season in mid-September and continue through to the end of February. Even outside of these dates, one should be aware of the potential risks, especially as the normal cycles of the natural world are being mutated by the reality of climate change. Similar to scrub clearance, which just to ensure everyone knows what I'm talking about, is basically removal of vegetation, generally to stop areas growing over which we want to be open. Okay, so as far as woodland management is concerned, whether that is creating new rides or glades, so either kind of linear features across the open features in the woodland or just open areas, maintaining existing ones, felling potentially dangerous trees, or coppicing. The paramount factor is once again to avoid the disturbance of nesting birds. An additional factor affecting woodland is the legal requirement not to disturb bats or their roosts. The recommendation generally is to carry out any unavoidable work only after an ecological assessment, which might have an impact on bats during the autumn months, therefore avoiding the most vulnerable periods when either the bats are hibernating or their non-flying young may be present. As far as coppicing is concerned, the traditional coppice season is from October through February. For preference, if you are planning to use the products of your coppicing to make stakes and binders for use in hedge laying, it is probably best to try and coppice early in the season so you can then concentrate on the hedge work for the remainder. It also has the benefit of winter coppicing of promoting stronger regrowth rather than cutting when the plants are in full leaf, which some commercial coppicers will do so that they have a constant source of product to sell. Tree planting is, of course, a very popular and well-publicised activity in the current climate. Trees should be planted while they're dormant and less likely to be damaged in the process. This is between November and March. Ideally, early planting is preferable as root growth is able to start immediately, and the young tree can take advantage of the surge in new feeding roots in March as the soil warms. This gives them an advantage over later planted trees. Okay, hedgerows, various different techniques are used to manage hedgerows. First of which is creating a hedgerow in the first place. As for trees, same rules apply. Also remembering, and also for trees as well, to avoid doing it while the ground is frozen or waterlogged. If it's frozen, it's going to be a hell of a lot harder to dig the hole to put your plant in, and if it's waterlogged, then you run the risk of the roots rotting, and your new plant isn't going to live. The next one will be hedge cutting. Similar with any removal or cutting of vegetation, the same legal restrictions apply regarding bird nesting season. In addition to this, best practice, if feasible, and this can be affected by by how muddy the ground is, for instance, if you're doing it by machinery, things along those lines. But ideally, if you can wait till after Christmas, so kind of January or February time, so that wildlife can get as much benefit as possible from the kind of autumn, early winter larder provided by many hedgerow plants. Then we go hedge laying. Again, this traditional countryside practice follows similar guidelines to those we've already laid out for scrub or woodland work. So once again, season run from September through to around the end of February. As I mentioned earlier, if you are following the time-honoured route of coppicing to create the stakes and binders for hedge laying, then you would generally be carrying out your hedge work in the second half of the season. If buying the material from a commercial coppicer, then obviously this isn't a problem. This also has the benefit again of you're not knocking berries or nuts off the plants that you are hedge laying. Okay, another management technique, which is a great benefit to a range of plant and animal species across a number of different habitats. Heathland, in this particular case, is bare ground creation. This can either be done by creating kind of open areas as shown in the picture, or even just the generation of little spots of bare ground scattered across a site to emulate the effects of herd grazing herbivores, for instance. Now, this doesn't necessarily have a set time of year. Generally, it's carried out in early spring or late summer, early autumn, being careful not to disturb any ground nesting birds. However, as long as care is taken throughout the summer is also fine. This avoids the generally busiest periods of winter works. Personally, I would say early is probably to be recommended, as the ground tends to be softer and an awful lot easier to dig. Invasive species. So dealing with the three kind of main invasive plant species that we spend time removing. The key to managing invasive plant species is to clear them once they're tall enough to locate easily from amongst surrounding vegetation, but before they drop seed. Now for ragwort, pictured there, in case no one knows, people don't know what it is, this will tend to be during June or July time, while for Himalayan balsam, May, June and July should be fine. Some years the work can carry on later or finish earlier, depending on the impact of weather on when the plants seed. When I was a volunteer, for instance, I cleared Himalayan balsam by putting a carrier bag over the head of each individual plant as it was pulled out of the ground to catch the seeds, as we were carrying out the work too late in the year. It's not something I would recommend. For bracken clearance, the cutoff tends to be sometime in August, when the fronds are covered in carcinogenic spores released by disturbance, therefore unsafe to work with. Again, May, June, July, therefore, again, the best months to carry this out. This does depend on the weather. Have been out bracken clearing in May and the plants were less than 10 centimetres tall on a site where the same area was over a foot tall the previous year. Bracken needs 2 visits around a month to 6 weeks apart. So you need to plan this in so that the plant is weakened the most and its food stored depleted by being cut or bruised twice. Ponds and ditches. So pond and ditch management. This agrees with some of what Ben says, slightly contradicts the other bit. Generally speaking, kind of best practice is often regarded for clearing vegetation or removing silt or other debris from pond or ditches in September through November. The reason for this is it reduces the impact on the pond residents and other visitors by avoiding the breeding and hibernation seasons. Also avoids the issue of algal blooms being created by sediment disturbance. Hopefully also, from a practical point of view, this time year the water levels will be lower than later in the winter and vegetation should be dying, therefore making work easier. As far as pond planting is concerned, the best time of year is May or June when the plants are quickly able to establish themselves. The other period is September, October, when any plants removed from other ponds on the same site as part of the above management can be transplanted, therefore removing the need to acquire new plants. Grassland management, I'll only touch on this briefly. Isabel already mentioned it on her beautiful management wheel. Just to reinforce the message, generally best practice is to mow and collect the cuttings in late winter, then to leave it alone until a further cut and collect in August to September, once most plants have dropped seed. As she said, the highly publicised No Mow May campaign is just the start. And the last one I'm going to deal with is hibernacular. These are egg-laying and hibernation spots for various reptiles and amphibians. They can be created at any time of year, depending on when the materials, such as grass cutting in the picture on the right, or logs in the one on the left, are available. Management work depends on the type. A simple heap of vegetation that grass snakes, for example, would use to lay their eggs shouldn't be disturbed between June and September. As these heaps can also be used for hibernation by snakes or slowworms, they, along with the more structural hibernacular shown on the left, should remain undisturbed over the winter. Therefore, the time of year to replenish the heaps or carry out maintenance work is limited to April or May time or October. Right, thank you all for listening, and hopefully you now have an awareness of how the different tasks in the conservation calendar are scheduled.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stuart. Really interesting, really useful tips there. I'm really sorry that we're running a little bit over, but clearly everybody's really passionate about their topic. We thought I really want to answer some of the questions. So I'm going to quickly go. We've got our panel here. The first question I think is probably one for Ben, and that was, how should we improve a pond that suffers from incoming nutrients, which promotes especially things like blanket weed, duckweed?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Sorry, it's a really good question. It's a really tricky one, actually, because so many people suffer from that problem, particularly in new ponds, where the pond's just establishing itself and people get big blooms of algae and blanket weed in the first year and they're like, oh no, it's all gone wrong. But there are a couple of things you can do, or you can try to do at least. Some people suggest using liquid barley, I think, which you can put into the water and sometimes can reduce the nutrients. Sometimes people put like actual bales of barley in the water as well, which achieves the same thing. You can also try and buy in some sort of biological solutions. So, for example, by trying to increase the populations of things like water fleas and other zooplankton in your pond, that will help the food chain actually deal with the kind of algal growth that is created by the excess nutrients, put things back into balance. But the main thing, as with many things in aquatic ecology, is that you need to treat the cause, not the symptoms. So you need to really find out why there are nutrients going into your water body and deal with that, or else whatever kind of remedy, plaster, band-aid you try and put on top of the issue is not going to ever resolve it fully. You need to find out where the nutrients are getting in from, whether that's because you're applying them to the surrounding land, or if, for example, you're filling up the pond with tap water rather than rainwater. There could be various reasons why they're getting into there, and that's the most important thing to address, I would say.
Great. If any of the other panelists, when someone want to add something, wave your hand vigorously. Right. The next question was, we've seeded a strip. This is from Claire Ben. She said, we've seeded a strip on the village green, which is 3 meters by 50 meters 2 years ago, and they've now got a huge amount of plantain growing in it. So how does she go about getting a good balance going forward with her wildflower? I think that's probably one for Isabel as a starting point.
Yes, I was a bit worried about that question, I'm afraid. So I should just admit that I'm actually not an ecologist, and I'm not the technical sort of expert on the plantain in particular. I could answer the yellow rattle question, but not the plantain. So I don't know whether Stuart, you could answer the question specifically around plantain. If not, I can certainly go away and get a response sort of for you, Claire.
To be fair, probably outside my area of expertise as well. I mean, potentially, I would suggest, maybe just removing individual plants, thinning it out.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. I just wasn't quite sure whether that was, if you've got too much of anything, you take something.
That would be my advice. That's what we've been doing. Her second question was about the yellow rattle, and she's been trying to get it growing, but not having much success. And she's aware that she needs cold for germination. But have you got any tips for how to get the yellow rattle successful in growing in a meadow?
So one of the other key things is that actually yellow rattle seed is only viable for quite a short space of time. So you do need to make sure that the seed is very fresh. It is only viable for probably a year. So whether that's perhaps something that you need to consider. You're quite right. Yes, it needs the germination period. So really it needs to be planted in the autumn, not in the winter. So by sort of November, probably at the latest, to allow that to germinate in those colder conditions. Also, just the area doesn't need to be too fertile. So as long as the cuttings are being removed afterwards as well, that should help to reduce the fertility sort of over time. So those are probably the key things. But it is quite tricky to establish. So, I can only suggest you just try and keep going. And it might take a couple of years to do so.
Great. Thanks, Isabel. Okay, the next question is from Amy. And I think this one's probably for Ben as well, but Stuart might have something here. She's asking, what's the biggest mistake people make when they start building a pond?
Good question. Off the top of my head, the main two, one of which I kind of already alluded to, is filling up your pond with rainwater can be one of the biggest mistakes people can make. That obviously, not filling up your pond with rainwater and using tap water instead. Obviously, that's the right way around. So people often will use tap water because they're impatient. They don't want to wait for it to fill up naturally, or it's just not raining enough. But with tap water comes all of the nutrients, etc., and all of the other chemicals that are part of our tap water, because they make it safe for human consumption. But those will inevitably cause big blooms of blanket weed, algae, other things, and your pond will not look nice, as for the first year at least, and possibly longer, because you have kind of already started off with a bit of problem in the water. So the best thing to do is to use something like a water butt, a rain butt, to catch rainwater and use that to fill up your pond. If you can't do that, there are ways of dechlorinating tap water. You can buy dechlorination tablets, or some people, which I think works quite well, is they'll fill up a big bucket of tap water, but then leave it outside for I think 48 hours, and then it will sort of sort itself out, and then you can safely use it to fill up your pond. But putting it straight from the tap into the pond is a big no-no. The other big mistake people make is around when they're actually building it and digging it, what kind of liners to use. There's lots and lots of different options for that out there. Some of them work really well, some of them don't really well. Some of them are really dependent on what kind of soil you have, how much money you have to spend. So it's worth really doing your research into what is the most appropriate one for the kind of pond you're trying to build and where you're trying to build it before you start digging and commit to one rather than another. I think one of the links I gave Claire has some more info on that, but I wouldn't go into it now because it would take ages.
Great, thanks, Ben. There's a question from Veronica. She's asking, is Surrey County Council pesticide free yet? We don't have anyone from Surrey County Council here. It's a pretty big question because they're involved in so many different aspects, highways, countryside, different side. So I think the best thing would be to talk, speak to your county councillor, and also that's a really good way of you engaging with them and influencing them. But I do know lots of councils are going pesticide free. So in my area, I live in the west of the county, and Waverley has gone pesticide free and Guildford are going pesticide free. So there are lots who are staying. So I think it's really good, get in touch with your councils and ask the questions. I think that's the best thing we should be, what we should be doing. There's another question from Claire quickly. How do you best decide what should be open and what should be left as scrub? Because some scrub is really, really beneficial. And I'll combine that. She then goes on and says, for example, she's got ragwort as well. And Stuart, you were mentioning about clearing it, but actually it's really beneficial for some moths like cinnamon moth. So should we really be getting rid of all of it, particularly if your meadows is not going to be for animal feed? Because I think that's the problem with ragwort, if it goes into animal feed. So perhaps, Stuart, you...
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so ragwort, I mean, ideally, if you've got ragwort, then ragwort is a fabulous plant for invertebrates. As you say, cinnamon moth caterpillars, it's the larval food plant. The only time when you should be removing it is, for instance, if the field is being cut for hay. Generally, most grazing animals that are, for whom ragwort is poisonous, are sensible enough to avoid it unless they are starving while it's growing. As soon as that's been cut and mixed in with everything else, they can't avoid it, and they can't tell it's there. So that's where you need to have it removed. There is also, as far as I'm aware, a legal requirement to stop it spreading to surrounding land, especially again if you're in kind of pasture areas where, again, you could then be causing danger, in which case you need to remove it. So that's, but yeah, ideally, if it can be left in sight, or even kind of if you are just literally clearing the area that's going to be mown for hay, but leaving kind of buffer zone, something along those lines, that would be brilliant. Similarly with the scrub part of the question, yeah, absolutely, scrub is brilliant for wildlife. I mean, effectively, kind of a hedgerow, if you think of it, is a long linear line of scrub. So it does depend where you are, and similar to what I was saying, leaving buffer zones, even if you are clearing an area, leave an edge. So you are not literally going from grassland instantly into woodland. You have a scrub edge between the grassland and the woodland, creating that buffer zone that will benefit loads of different species. But even if you are clearing, for instance, an area of chalk grassland I work on a lot, we have actually kind of adapted our technique. So we're actually leaving little islands of scrub scattered around the grassland area, so that it acts as shelter for invertebrates, benefits all sorts of different species.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Right, we're coming to the end. I'm determined we're going to finish by 7. So thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers. They've all been really inspiring, really inspired me to get back out there. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. I hope you really enjoyed the webinars. Don't forget, we're holding our fourth one again in January, and we'll be publishing the details shortly, and it'll be open for booking. There'll be a link about this, so you can book your seminar as soon as that's available. So we hope you can join us for our next one in January. Have a very safe and pleasant Christmas, and look forward to seeing you again in the new year. Bye all.